The chalk dust settled on Eleanor Drake's fingertips as she wrote the final word on the board, and every man in that packed saloon knew their world had just shifted beneath their boots. It was August 1885 in Coolidge, Arizona, a town born from the railroad boom and sustained by copper mining, where the desert heat could kill a man faster than a rattlesnake bite. The Silver Dollar Saloon had never seen such a crowd, standing room only, with men pressed shoulder to shoulder, and the scent of whiskey, sweat, and tobacco thick enough to choke on. They had come to witness what folks were calling the most unusual spectacle in territorial history. A debate about women's suffrage, with the anti-suffrage side represented by Mayor Cornelius Webb himself, and the pro-suffrage side represented by a woman who could not speak. Eleanor Drake had arrived in Coolidge 3 months prior, stepping off the train with a worn carpet bag and a slate board tucked under her arm. She was 24 years old. With auburn hair she kept pinned back in a practical bun, green eyes that held both intelligence and sorrow, and a throat scarred by the fever that had stolen her voice when she was 16. The town's first schoolteacher had quit after 2 weeks, unable to handle the rough mining children, and the school board was desperate enough to hire a mute woman with impeccable references from a Boston teaching academy. What they had not expected was her fire. What they had not expected was her refusal to accept the world as it was handed to her. Duncan Xavier sat in the back corner of the saloon, his hat tipped low over his eyes, but his attention sharp as a knife's edge. He was 27, tall and lean from years of ranch work, with dark hair that curled at his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. He had been working the Xavier Ranch since his father died 5 years back, building it from a struggling cattle operation into something that could survive the harsh Arizona territory. He came to town once a week for supplies and rarely stayed longer than necessary, preferring the company of horses to people. But he had heard about the schoolteacher who wrote her lessons on boards and made children actually want to learn. He had heard about the woman who had stood up at a town meeting and demanded, through written words held high, that the schoolhouse receive the same funding as the new billiard hall. He had heard that Mayor Webb, bloated with self-importance and threatened by her persistence, had challenged her to this public debate, certain that a woman who could not speak could not possibly win an argument. The mayor stood now at the front of the saloon, his thumbs hooked in his vest, his jowls quivering as he spoke. And that, gentlemen, is why the fairer sex, while deserving of our protection and reverence, cannot be trusted with the vote. They are too emotional, too delicate in constitution, too easily swayed by sentiment rather than logic. It is not cruelty to deny them this right, but rather kindness, sparing them the burden of such weighty decisions. Applause erupted from half the crowd. Duncan noticed that the miners clapped loudest, the same ones who spent their wages on poker and painted ladies, the same ones who beat their wives on Saturday nights when the whiskey hit wrong. He kept his hand still. Eleanor stood beside a large blackboard that had been hauled in from the schoolhouse. She wore a simple blue dress with a white collar, no ornamentation, no frivolity. Her face remained calm, but Duncan saw her fingers tighten around the chalk. She had been writing throughout the mayor's entire speech, her hand moving quickly, precisely, each letter formed with the practiced care of an educator. The moderator, a newspaperman from Tucson who had come specifically to cover this unusual event, gestured to Eleanor. "Miss Drake, your rebuttal." She turned the blackboard around. Duncan leaned forward, reading along with everyone else, but he found himself watching her face as much as her words. There was something in her expression, a kind of fierce determination mixed with vulnerability that caught in his chest like a burr. The board read. Mayor Webb speaks of emotion as though it were a weakness unique to women. Yet I have seen men duel over insults to their pride. I have seen men start wars over perceived slights. I have seen men in this very town make decisions based on anger, on jealousy, on fear. Emotion is human, not female. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some men shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor wiped the board clean with smooth, efficient strokes and continued writing. The mayor speaks of delicate constitution, yet women cross deserts in covered wagons. Women birth children in frontier cabins with no doctor for 100 miles. Women run farms when their husbands die. Women work in laundries, in kitchens, in factories. We are strong enough to build this territory. Are we not strong enough to have a say in how it is governed? The applause this time came from the women clustered near the door, the ones who had been allowed to attend but not to sit, forced to stand in the back like children. Duncan found himself nodding before he caught himself. Mayor Webb's face had gone red. This is absurd. How can we have a proper debate when one party cannot even engage in the back and forth of argument? She writes prepared speeches, nothing more. The moderator looked uncertain, but Eleanor was already writing again, her chalk moving so fast it squeaked. When she turned the board, Duncan could see the hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth. If the mayor wishes for back and forth, let him ask me direct questions. I will answer them, unless he is afraid that my written words will prove more truthful than his spoken ones. The crowd erupted in shouts and laughter. Mayor Webb had been trapped by his own complaint, and everyone knew it. His face went from red to purple. "Fine," he snapped. "Tell me this, Miss Drake. If women get the vote, what is to stop them from neglecting their duties as wives and mothers? What happens to the home, to the family structure that is the foundation of civilized society?" Eleanor did not hesitate. Her hand moved across the board with the confidence of someone who had thought about these questions for years, who had lived with the frustration of having answers but no voice to speak them. Having a voice in government does not mean abandoning home. Men vote and still work their jobs. Men vote and still care for their families if they are good men. Why do you assume women are less capable of balance? Or is it that you fear we will vote away your power to make decisions for us without our consent? Duncan watched Mayor Webb's mouth open and close like a landed fish. The man had no answer, at least none that would not make him look worse. Eleanor was not done. She wiped the board and wrote again. "You speak of family, yet women have no legal right to their own children in most territories. A man can be a drunkard, a brute, a danger, and still the law gives him sole custody. Is that your civilized foundation? A structure where half the population is treated as property rather than people?" The saloon had gone quiet. These were not comfortable truths, not things that polite society discussed. But Eleanor Drake was not interested in polite society. She was interested in truth. Mayor Webb tried to regain ground. The law is the law, created by men wiser than us, built on centuries of tradition. You would append all of that on the whim of a few dissatisfied women. Eleanor's chalk moved again, slower this time, each word deliberate. The law once said men could own other men. Tradition once said the earth was flat. Wisdom is not in blindly following the past, but in having the courage to correct its mistakes. If the law is unjust, it must change. That is not whim. That is progress. The newspaperman from Tucson was scribbling frantically in his notebook. Duncan could already see the headline forming. "Mute schoolteacher defeats mayor in suffrage debate." Because that was what was happening. Everyone in the saloon could feel it. Mayor Webb had come expecting an easy victory, a chance to publicly humiliate a woman who had become a thorn in his side. Instead, he was being systematically dismantled by chalk, dust, and truth. The mayor tried several more angles, each one batted away by Eleanor's swift, precise responses. She wrote about taxation without representation, about women property owners who paid into town coffers but had no say in how that money was spent. She wrote about education, about how denying women the vote meant denying them full citizenship, which in turn justified denying them equal education, equal pay, equal respect. She wrote about justice, about how a system that excluded half its population from participation was not a democracy, but an oligarchy. With each answer, Duncan found himself more captivated. He had never thought much about women's suffrage one way or another. It seemed like an issue for city folk, for politicians back east. But watching Eleanor argue, watching her use nothing but logic and truth to dismantle decades of assumption, he began to understand that this was about more than voting. This was about whether women were fully human in the eyes of the law or something less. Finally, after an hour that felt like both a lifetime and a heartbeat, the moderator called time. "Gentlemen and ladies, it is time to vote. All in favor of Mayor Webb's position that women should not have the right to vote, raise your hands." About half the hands in the saloon went up, maybe less. Duncan kept his down. "All in favor of Miss Drake's position that women should have the right to vote, raise your hands." More hands rose this time, significantly more. Even accounting for the women in the back, Eleanor had won over a substantial number of men. The moderator counted twice to be sure, then announced, "By a margin of 63 to 48, the debate goes to Miss Drake." The saloon erupted in chaos, some men cheering, others cursing, Mayor Webb storming out with his supporters behind him. But Duncan only watched Eleanor. She stood very still for a moment, her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes bright with tears she would not let fall. Then the women from the back surged forward, embracing her, congratulating her, and she was lost in a sea of calico and determination. Duncan slipped out into the night, the desert air cooling quickly now that the sun had set. He walked to where his horse, a steady buckskin gelding named Copper, waited at the hitching post. But he did not mount. He stood there, one hand on the saddle, thinking about chalk, dust, and truth. He was still standing there when Eleanor emerged from the saloon 20 minutes later, her carpetbag in one hand and her slate board in the other. She looked exhausted, but there was a satisfaction in her expression that made her beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with features and everything to do with spirit. She noticed him and paused, tilting her head in question. Duncan realized he had been staring. "That was something in there," he said, then felt foolish. What kind of comment was that? But Eleanor smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. She pulled out her slate and wrote quickly, the chalk a whisper in the darkness. She held it up to catch the light from the saloon window. "Thank you." "I am Duncan Xavier," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I have a ranch about 5 miles north of town. I just wanted to say what you did in there that took courage, and you were right, about all of it." She studied him for a moment as if trying to determine his sincerity, then wrote again. "Eleanor Drake, though I suppose you knew that." He found himself smiling. "I suppose I did. Can I walk you home, Miss Drake? It is late." She hesitated, and he saw the wariness that any woman alone in a rough town would have. But something in his face must have reassured her, because she nodded. They walked through Coolidge's dusty streets, past the assay office and the general store, past the Chinese laundry and the boarding house where the railroad workers stayed. Eleanor lived in a small cottage behind the schoolhouse, one room with a stove, a bed, a desk, and shelves lined with books. Duncan carried her slate board while she held the carpet bag, and they did not speak, but the silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. At her door, she turned and wrote on the slate, "Why did you wait outside?" Duncan considered the question. "I guess I wanted to tell you that what you said mattered, that it changed something in me, the way I see things, and I thought you should know that." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, and in the moonlight her green eyes were luminous. She wrote, "Most people are afraid of what I have to say because of how I have to say it. You listened anyway." "Your words do not need sound to have power," Duncan said quietly. "Anyone with ears can hear. It takes a mind to actually listen." He saw her breath catch, saw something shift in her expression. Then she wrote one more line. "Would you like to come to Sunday dinner tomorrow? I make a decent roast chicken." Duncan felt his heart kick against his ribs. "I would like that very much, Miss Drake." "Eleanor," she wrote and underlined it. "Eleanor," he repeated, and the name felt right in his mouth. "Then you should call me Duncan." She nodded, smiled, and slipped inside her cottage. Duncan stood there for a moment longer, then walked back to Copper, mounted up, and rode home under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. The ranch was quiet when he arrived, just the sound of cattle settling for the night and the wind moving through the scrub brush. He took care of Copper, then sat on his porch, smoking a cigarette and thinking about a woman with chalk dust on her fingers and revolution in her eyes. Sunday came hot and bright, the sun turning the desert into a furnace. Duncan washed carefully, shaved, put on his cleanest shirt and his good pants. He rode into town with a jar of honey from his beehives and a sense of anticipation that felt both exciting and terrifying. Eleanor answered the door wearing a green dress that matched her eyes, her hair down for the first time he had seen, falling in waves to her shoulders. She held up her slate. "You brought honey from my own bees," Duncan said. "Thought it might go well with biscuits if you are making any." She smiled and stepped aside to let him in. The cottage smelled like rosemary and roasting chicken. The table was set for two, with wildflowers in a jar serving as a centerpiece. It was simple, but there was a care to it that made Duncan's chest feel tight. Eleanor gestured for him to sit, then moved between the stove and the table with practiced efficiency, bringing out the chicken, roasted potatoes, green beans, and yes, biscuits. When everything was ready, she sat across from him and bowed her head. Duncan did the same, saying a quiet grace, then looked up to find her watching him with approval. They ate, and it was the strangest meal Duncan had ever shared. Eleanor would eat a few bites, then write something on her slate propped against the flour jar. He would respond, eat a bit more, wait for her reply. It should have been awkward, but instead it felt intimate, like they were creating their own language. She asked about his ranch, and he told her about building it up after his father's death, about the struggle to keep cattle alive in drought years, about his small experiments with irrigation. She told him, through careful chalk letters, about growing up in Philadelphia, about the fever that took her voice and her mother in the same terrible week, about finding purpose in teaching when she thought she had lost everything. "Why come west?" Duncan asked, spreading honey on his third biscuit. Eleanor wrote, "In Philadelphia, people saw my silence as tragedy, as something to pity. Here, people see what I do, not what I cannot do. Also, the school board was desperate enough to look past convention." "Their desperation was good fortune for those children," Duncan said. "I've heard folks say their kids actually want to go to school now. That is a miracle in a town like this." She smiled at that, a pleased, almost shy expression that made Duncan want to make her smile again and again. After dinner, she made coffee and they moved to the small porch, sitting in mismatched chairs and watching the heat shimmer off the desert. Duncan found himself talking more than he usually did, telling her about his dreams for the ranch, about wanting to try breeding horses, about the loneliness of building something with no one to share it with. Eleanor listened, really listened, her eyes never leaving his face. Then she wrote, "Loneliness is louder than any voice." "Yes," Duncan said softly. "Yes, it is," she wrote again. "Thank you for seeing me, not the woman who cannot speak, just me." "Eleanor," Duncan said and reached over to take her hand. She let him, her fingers small and strong in his. "I see you, and I would like to keep seeing you if you are willing." She set down her slate and used her free hand to touch his face, a question and an answer all at once. Duncan leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not. Their lips met gentle and careful, a first kiss that tasted like honey and coffee and possibility. When they pulled apart, Eleanor was smiling, and Duncan knew that his life had just changed direction as surely as a river meeting bedrock. Over the following weeks, Duncan found excuses to come to town more often. He would bring supplies for the schoolhouse, firewood for Eleanor's stove, fresh vegetables from his garden. She would save him dinner, or they would take walks in the evening when the heat broke, or simply sit together on her porch, her slate filling with thoughts and his voice responding. The town noticed, of course. Coolidge was too small for courtship to go unremarked. Some folks thought it sweet, the quiet rancher and the silent teacher. Others, particularly those still smarting from Eleanor's debate victory, whispered that Duncan was being bewitched, that no good would come of mixing with a woman who had such radical ideas. Mayor Webb, still furious over his public humiliation, began making noise about Eleanor's contract. He claimed that her political activities were inappropriate for someone in charge of educating children. Never mind that she had done nothing but answer a challenge he himself had issued. Duncan heard about it from Sam Porter, the blacksmith, who heard it from his wife, who heard it from the mayor's housekeeper. He rode straight to Eleanor's cottage, arriving just as school was letting out for the day. She was wiping down the blackboards, her students having scattered to their various homes and chores. Duncan waited until the last child left, then stepped inside the schoolhouse. Eleanor turned, saw his face, and immediately picked up her slate. "What happened?" "Webb is trying to get you fired," Duncan said without preamble. "He is claiming you are too political to teach children." Her face went pale, then flushed with anger. She wrote quickly, "My personal views have nothing to do with my teaching. The children learn reading, writing, arithmetic, history, science. I have never once tried to influence their politics." "I know that," Duncan said. "Anyone with eyes knows that, but Webb has influence on the school board and he is using it." Eleanor sat down hard in her desk chair. Duncan saw her hands shaking as she wrote, "This job is all I have. Without it, I have no income, no home. I would have to leave Coolidge." The thought of her leaving hit Duncan like a physical blow. In just a few weeks, she had become essential to him, the center around which his days revolved. He crossed to her, knelt beside her chair, took her hand. "Then we fight," he said firmly. "We get the parents of your students to speak for you. We get the school board to see sense. And if that does not work," he paused, his heart pounding, then pressed forward. "If that does not work, you marry me. You would not need the teaching job. The ranch makes enough for two." Eleanor stared at him, her eyes wide. She pulled her hand free and wrote with shaking fingers, "You are proposing marriage to save my job." "No," Duncan said. "I am proposing marriage because I have fallen in love with you. The job situation just makes the timing more urgent." She dropped the chalk. It clattered on the wooden floor. She looked at him, searching his face for something, and whatever she found there made her eyes fill with tears. She picked up the chalk and wrote, "I love you too." Duncan released a breath he had not known he was holding. Then say yes. Say you will marry me and we will face whatever comes together. She wrote one word. Yes. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, feeling her silent tears soak into his shirt. When she pulled back, she was smiling through the tears, and Duncan kissed her, tasting salt and joy. But they still had the problem of Mayor Webb. Duncan had meant what he said about fighting, and Eleanor, he was learning, had no quit in her. Over the next week, they organized. Eleanor wrote letters to every parent whose child attended school, inviting them to speak at the next school board meeting. Duncan rode to neighboring ranches, talking to anyone who would listen about the injustice being done. The night of the school board meeting, the town hall was packed even fuller than the saloon had been during the debate. Parents stood with their children, ready to testify. Ranchers and farmers who rarely came to town had made the journey. Even some of the miners, the ones whose children had learned to read under Eleanor's teaching, showed up. Mayor Webb sat at the head of the table with the other 4 board members, looking less confident than usual. He called the meeting to order, then launched into his complaint about Eleanor's unsuitability. Before he could finish, Thomas Garrett, a rancher with 6 children, stood up. "I have something to say about Miss Drake." The mayor tried to wave him down, but the crowd would not have it. Thomas continued, "Before Miss Drake, my children hated school. My oldest boy ran away twice rather than go. Now they are reading books. My daughter is doing sums in her head. My youngest writes letters to his grandmother back in Missouri. Miss Drake did that. Her politics have got nothing to do with her teaching, and anyone saying otherwise is a liar or a fool." The room erupted in agreement. One by one, parents stood and spoke. They talked about children who had been falling behind now excelling. They talked about Miss Drake staying late to help students who struggled. They talked about her using her own money to buy books for the school library. They talked about their children coming home excited to learn. Mayor Webb's face grew redder with each testimony. Finally, one of the other board members, a lawyer named Harrison Blake, held up his hand for silence. "Mayor Webb," he said carefully, "I am failing to see any evidence that Miss Drake has done anything wrong. What I am hearing is that she is the best teacher this town has ever had. Unless you have specific proof of misconduct, I move that we end this proceeding and confirm her employment." 2 other board members immediately seconded the motion. Mayor Webb looked around the table, seeing he was outnumbered, and fury twisted his features. "Fine," he spat. "Keep your radical schoolteacher, but do not come crying to me when she fills those children's heads with dangerous ideas about overthrowing the natural order. The only dangerous ideas in this room are yours, Cornelius," said Sarah Mitchell, a widow who owned the general store. "You are afraid of a woman smarter than you, and that says more about your weakness than her character." The room broke into applause and laughter. Mayor Webb stormed out for the 2nd time in a month, defeated by the woman he had tried to destroy. Duncan found Eleanor outside the town hall, surrounded by grateful parents and their children. When she saw him, her face lit up, and she excused herself through written notes, making her way to his side. He took her hand, not caring who saw. "You won again." She pulled out her slate. "We won." "You helped make this happen." "You made it happen," Duncan corrected. "By being so good at what you do that people could not help but see the truth. I just helped them get heard." They walked back to her cottage under a sky beginning to fill with stars. Inside, Eleanor lit the lamps and put on coffee, moving around her small space with easy familiarity. Duncan watched her, thinking about how she would soon be moving to the ranch, how this cottage would belong to someone else, how her books and slates would fill his empty house. "When should we marry?" he asked. Eleanor wrote, "Soon. I do not want to wait." "Next Sunday," she nodded, then wrote, "Small ceremony, just us and a few friends. Perfect." Duncan agreed. He had no family left, and Eleanor's was all back east, estranged since they had disapproved of her going west. A small ceremony suited them both. They spent the evening making plans. Eleanor would finish the school term, which ended in 2 weeks. They would marry the following Sunday. She would continue teaching as long as the school board wanted her, but she would live at the ranch, making the commute each day. Duncan would build her a study in one of the empty rooms, a place for her books and her writing. The week passed in a blur of preparation. Eleanor arranged for someone to take over her cottage. Duncan cleaned his house from top to bottom, suddenly seeing how bare it looked, how much it needed a woman's touch. He bought new curtains from the general store, ordered a proper stove from the catalog, built bookshelves in what would be Eleanor's study. On Saturday, he rode into town and knocked on Eleanor's door, his stomach full of nerves that seemed ridiculous for a man of 27. She answered wearing her blue dress, the one she had worn to the debate, and holding her slate. "Tomorrow," he said, and could not keep the wonder from his voice. She wrote, "Tomorrow I become your wife." "Are you nervous?" She considered, then wrote, "Excited, grateful, a little scared, but certain this is right." Duncan pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "I will spend every day trying to be worthy of you." She pulled back and wrote, "You already are." They married in the small church at the edge of town, with Reverend Thompson officiating. Sarah Mitchell stood witness for Eleanor, and Sam Porter stood for Duncan. The church was not empty, though, despite their plans for a small ceremony. Word had spread, and the pews were full of students and parents, of townspeople who had come to respect Eleanor, of folks who wanted to see the silent teacher and the quiet rancher pledge their lives to each other. Eleanor wore a simple white dress that Sarah had helped her sew. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers that the schoolchildren had gathered. Duncan wore his best suit, brushed clean of dust, his hair slicked back, his heart hammering against his ribs. When Reverend Thompson asked for vows, Duncan spoke as clearly. "I, Duncan Xavier, take you, Eleanor Drake, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to honor you, to cherish you, to listen to every word you write, and to speak for you when you need me to. I promise to be your partner in all things, to build a life with you that is worthy of both our dreams. I promise to love you until my last breath and beyond." Eleanor had written her vows on her slate. The Reverend read them aloud. "I, Eleanor Drake, take you, Duncan Xavier, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to honor you, to cherish you, to fill our home with love even though I cannot fill it with spoken words. I promise to be your partner in all things, to work beside you building the life we both want. I promise to love you until my last breath and beyond." They exchanged simple gold bands, and when Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, Duncan kissed Eleanor with a tenderness that made the watching women sigh and the men grin. The church erupted in applause, and Eleanor's students rushed forward, surrounding them with joy and congratulations. There was a celebration at the Silver Dollar Saloon afterward, the same place where Eleanor had debated Mayor Webb. The owner, a gruff man named Pete who had been won over by Eleanor's courage, had donated the space and the first round of drinks. There was food and music, and Duncan danced with his wife, amazed at how perfectly she fit in his arms, how she anticipated his movements, how they communicated without words. As the sun set, they slipped away, riding double on Copper back to the ranch. Eleanor sat in front of Duncan, his arms around her holding the reins, her head leaning back against his chest. The desert was cooling, the sky turning purple and gold, and Duncan thought he had never been so happy in his entire life. The ranch house was dark when they arrived, but Duncan had prepared for this. He lit lamps in every room, revealing the cleaned floors, the new curtains, the wildflowers he had placed in vases throughout the house. Eleanor turned in a slow circle, taking it all in, then pulled out her slate. "You did this for me. I want you to feel at home here," Duncan said. "This is your house as much as mine now. Anything you want to change, we change," she wrote. "It is perfect because you are here." Duncan carried her over the threshold, a tradition that made her laugh silently, her shoulders shaking with mirth. He set her down gently in the bedroom, where he had placed more wildflowers, where the bed was made with new linens, where moonlight streamed through the window and painted everything silver. They came together with a tenderness born of patience, of really knowing each other. Duncan had been with women before, but never like this, never with this sense of connection, of two souls recognizing each other. Eleanor's silence was not an absence but a presence, her touches and expressions communicating everything words could and more. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Duncan's fingers tracing idle patterns on Eleanor's shoulder, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. She reached for the slate she had brought to the bedside and wrote, "Thank you for choosing me." "Eleanor," Duncan said softly, tilting her face up to meet his eyes, "you are the easiest choice I have ever made." She kissed him again, and they made love once more, slower this time, learning each other, building the physical vocabulary of their marriage. Life settled into a rhythm after that. Eleanor continued teaching, rising before dawn to help Duncan with morning chores before riding into town. He bought her a gentle mare named Willow, and each morning he watched her ride away, and each evening he waited on the porch for her return, his heart lifting at the sight of her coming home. The schoolchildren loved knowing their teacher lived on a ranch. They asked constant questions about the cattle, the horses, the chickens Duncan kept. Eleanor invited them for a field trip one Saturday, and Duncan found himself explaining irrigation to 20 curious children, while Eleanor watched with amusement dancing in her eyes. At night, they sat together on the porch or by the fire, Eleanor writing on her slate, Duncan responding, creating conversations that needed no sound. She told him about her students' progress, about the books she was reading, about ideas for expanding the school curriculum. He told her about the ranch, about his plans to dig a new well, about his dreams of building something that would last beyond their lifetimes. 3 months into their marriage, Eleanor came home from school looking thoughtful. "Over dinner," she wrote, "there are more girls wanting to attend school. But some fathers say it is pointless to educate daughters." Duncan felt familiar anger rise. "What did you tell them?" "That I would teach any child who wanted to learn, regardless of gender, but I worry they will just keep their daughters home." "Then we convince them otherwise," Duncan said. "Same as we did with the school board. We show them what educated women can accomplish. We show them you." Eleanor smiled but wrote, "I have an idea. What if we started evening classes for women? Reading, writing, arithmetic for those who never had the chance to learn." "The schoolhouse is empty after 4 o'clock. "That is a brilliant idea," Duncan said immediately. "How can I help?" Over the next weeks, they organized the evening classes. Eleanor wrote notices that were posted around town. Duncan spoke to ranchers and miners, encouraging them to let their wives and daughters attend. Sarah Mitchell donated primers and slates from her store. Reverend Thompson let it be known from the pulpit that he supported the endeavor. The first night, 12 women showed up, ranging from 17 to 60 years old. Some were wives wanting to write letters to distant family. Some were young women hoping to better themselves. One was a former soiled dove from the saloon, trying to build a respectable life. Duncan watched through the window as Eleanor taught, her patience infinite, her encouragement written large on the blackboard. The women were hesitant at first, embarrassed by their lack of knowledge. But Eleanor had a gift for making learning feel safe, and soon they were bent over their slates, forming letters with intense concentration. It became a regular occurrence, 3 evenings a week. Duncan would ride into town with Eleanor, take care of errands or have a drink with Sam Porter, then collect his wife and ride home under the stars. Eleanor glowed with purpose, energized by helping these women claim a piece of education they had been denied. Not everyone approved, of course. Mayor Webb made his usual complaints about Eleanor being a troublemaker. Some husbands grumbled about their wives being gone in the evenings. But the women kept coming, and slowly, the town began to change. The woman from the saloon, whose name was Clara, learned to read well enough to get a job keeping books for the general store. A young wife named Martha started writing poetry, beautiful verses about desert sunsets and frontier hardship that she shared shyly with the class. An older woman named Ruth read the Bible in her own language for the first time and wept with the joy of it. Winter came, as much as it came in Arizona, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain. Duncan spent long days mending fences and preparing the ranch for the season. Eleanor knitted by the fire in the evenings, her needles clicking softly, creating scarves and socks for her students from the poorest families. Christmas approached, and Duncan wanted to give his wife something special. He thought about jewelry but knew Eleanor was not a woman for frivolous ornament. He considered books, but she had access to every volume she wanted through mail order. Finally, inspiration struck. He rode to Tucson, a 2-day journey, and found what he was looking for in a print shop. He commissioned a special order, paid extra for rush service, and rode back with his package carefully wrapped. Christmas morning, they exchanged gifts beside the fire. Eleanor gave him a shirt she had sewn herself, perfectly fitted, with his initials embroidered on the cuff. He gave her his package, watching nervously as she unwrapped it. Inside were 500 cards professionally printed that read, Eleanor Xavier, teacher and advocate. Below that, in smaller letters, voice by chalk, power by truth. Eleanor stared at the cards for a long moment, then looked up at Duncan with tears streaming down her face. She set the cards aside carefully and launched herself into his arms, holding him tight, her silent sobs shaking them both. You like them? Duncan asked, though her reaction had already answered. She pulled back and found her slate. They are perfect. You see me as I am and make me feel powerful rather than broken. How did I get so lucky? I am the lucky one, Duncan said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. Every single day, I am the lucky one. They made love there by the fire, slow and tender, the cards scattered around them like promises made real. Spring came with wildflowers carpeting the desert, explosions of color against the brown earth. Eleanor's evening classes had grown to over 20 women. Some had graduated to more advanced studies, while new students kept arriving. The schoolhouse buzzed with learning, with women discovering capabilities they had been told they did not possess. One evening in March, Duncan was waiting outside the schoolhouse when raised voices caught his attention. He moved to the door and saw Mayor Webb inside, his face red, his finger pointing at Eleanor. You are corrupting these women, he shouted, filling their heads with ideas above their station. You are destroying marriages, destroying families. Eleanor stood her ground, her chin raised, but Duncan saw her hand shake as she wrote on her slate. Before she could finish, he stepped inside. Mayor Webb, he said quietly, but with steel underneath. I believe you are in the wrong place. Xavier, the mayor sneered. Come to defend your wife. Tell me, is she so cold at home that she has to spend every evening with these other women instead of caring for her husband? Duncan's fist connected with the mayor's jaw before he consciously decided to throw the punch. Webb went down hard, sprawling on the schoolhouse floor. The women gasped, drawing back. Duncan stood over the mayor, his hand throbbing but his voice calm. "You will apologize to my wife. You will apologize to every woman in this room, and then you will leave and not come back." Mayor Webb scrambled to his feet, holding his jaw. "You will regret that, Xavier. I will have the law on you for assault." "Go ahead," Duncan said. "Explain to the sheriff why you were harassing my wife in the evening, making crude suggestions about our marriage. See how that plays out for you." Webb's eyes darted around the room, seeing the witnesses, calculating. Without another word, he turned and fled into the night. Duncan turned to Eleanor, suddenly worried she would be upset about the violence. But she was smiling, holding up her slate. "My hero." The women burst into laughter and applause. Duncan felt his face heat with embarrassment but could not help grinning. After the class ended and the women had filtered home, Eleanor and Duncan rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence. Once inside, Eleanor wrote, "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," Duncan said firmly. "No one talks about you that way. No one," she wrote. "He is right that I am changing things. Women are asking questions now, demanding more respect from their husbands, wanting to participate in decisions. Some men do not like it." "Those men are fools," Duncan said. "A partnership is stronger than a dictatorship. Surely they can see that." Eleanor wrote, "Not everyone is as secure as you." "I am not secure because I am better than them," Duncan said. "I am secure because I am married to you. You make me better. You challenge me to think and question and grow. That is a gift, not a threat." She set down the slate and pulled him into a kiss that communicated everything words could not. That night, as they lay in bed, Eleanor tapped Duncan's shoulder and showed him her slate by lamplight. "I want to start a newspaper column." "A column about what?" "About women's issues. Education, suffrage, property rights, everything we cannot say out loud in polite company but desperately needs to be said." The newspaperman from Tucson who covered the debate offered after he printed that story. "I have been thinking about it for months." Duncan propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at his wife's determined face. "It will make you more enemies. Webb already hates you. This will give him more ammunition." "I know," she wrote, "but I have to use whatever voice I have. If I stay silent about injustice, what is the point of all this?" "Then do it," Duncan said without hesitation. "Write your column. Change the world. I will be right here supporting you." She touched his face tenderly, and they came together again, creating their own language of touch and breath and heartbeat. The first column appeared 2 weeks later in the Tucson Gazette, distributed throughout the territory. It was titled "Thoughts from a Silent Teacher," and addressed the question of women's education. Eleanor wrote about her students, about the hunger for learning she saw in their eyes, about the practical benefits of an educated populace regardless of gender. She wrote with clarity and logic and passion, and her words hit like a hammer on stone. Responses poured in, both positive and negative. Some letters praised her insight. Others called her a troublemaker, a radical, a woman who needed to be put in her place. Eleanor read them all and kept writing, one column each week, each one tackling a different issue. She wrote about the legal status of married women, about how they had no right to property, no right to wages, no right even to their own bodies in the eyes of the law. She wrote about suffrage, about taxation without representation, about the absurdity of denying citizenship to half the population. She wrote about education, about opportunities, about the human cost of squandering talent based on arbitrary characteristics. Her columns were reprinted in papers across the territory. People began to recognize her name. Invitations came for her to speak at events, though of course she could not speak, so Duncan would go with her, reading her prepared remarks while she stood beside him, her presence itself an argument. They traveled to Tucson, to Phoenix, to small mining towns and railroad stops. Everywhere they went, women gathered to listen, to ask questions written on scraps of paper, to share their own stories of frustration and hope. Duncan watched his wife become a symbol, an icon of possibility, and felt fierce pride mixed with worry for her safety. The worry was not unfounded. In June, someone threw a rock through their window with a note attached. "Shut your wife up or we will shut her up permanent." Duncan reported it to the sheriff, who was sympathetic, but admitted there was little he could do without knowing who sent it. "Maybe you should stop the columns for a while," Duncan suggested that night, hating himself for saying it but terrified of losing her. Eleanor's response was immediate. "No, if I stop because of threats, they win. Fear wins. I will not live that way." "Then I am coming with you everywhere," Duncan said firmly. "No more riding to town alone. No more evening classes without me outside. I will not lose you to some coward with a rock or worse." She started to protest, but he took her hands, held them tight. "Eleanor, please, let me protect you, not because you are weak, but because you are precious. To me. To all those women who look to you for hope. Your voice matters too much to risk silencing it permanently." She studied his face, seeing the genuine fear there, and finally nodded. She wrote, "Together then, always together." "Always," Duncan agreed. True to his word, Duncan became her shadow. He rearranged the ranch work to accommodate her schedule. He hired a hand, a steady young man named Peter, to help with the daily labor so he could spend more time protecting his wife. He learned to enjoy sitting outside the schoolhouse, talking with other men who came to collect their wives, building unexpected alliances. Summer burned across the territory, and with it came more changes. 3 women in Coolidge registered to vote in the local election, despite having no legal right, citing Eleanor's columns about taxation without representation. The registrar, flustered, did not know what to do and accepted their registration. When they showed up on Election Day, Mayor Webb tried to have them arrested. The resulting scene in front of the town hall drew a crowd. Duncan and Eleanor arrived to find Webb screaming at Sarah Mitchell, Martha, and Ruth, calling them criminals and rebels. "We pay taxes," Sarah said calmly. "We own property. We are citizens. Show us the law that says we cannot vote." Webb sputtered, citing tradition and custom and natural order, but no actual statute because there was none. The territorial government had simply never considered that women would try. Eleanor stepped forward and held up a slate she had prepared. "The Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal and entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When it was written, men meant humans, not just males. We are claiming the rights we should have had all along." "This is insanity," Webb shouted. "These women have been corrupted by your radical ideas, Miss Drake or Mrs. Xavier, or whatever you call yourself. You have poisoned this town with your suffrage nonsense." "The only poison here is your fear of equality," Duncan said, stepping up beside his wife. "Let them vote. What are you afraid of? Setting a precedent," Webb snapped. "If they vote here, women everywhere will think they can do the same. It will be chaos." "It will be democracy," Eleanor wrote, and several people in the crowd applauded. In the end, the women did not get to vote that day. The territorial attorney general sent a telegram forbidding it, citing a lack of legal precedent. But the attempt made newspapers across the territory and even back east. Eleanor wrote a column about it, about the absurdity of paying taxes for a government that refused to represent you, and her words resonated with thousands of women, and more than a few men. The autumn brought unexpected developments. A coalition of suffragists from back east contacted Eleanor, asking her to represent the Arizona Territory at a national conference in Washington, D.C. It would mean traveling across the country, being gone for nearly 2 months. Eleanor showed Duncan the letter, her expression conflicted. "I want to go," she wrote, "but I do not want to leave you or my students for so long." "Your students will survive," Duncan said, though his heart was already aching at the thought of weeks without her. "And so will I. This is important, Eleanor. This is a chance to influence the whole country, not just the territory." "Come with me," she wrote immediately. Duncan thought about the ranch, about the responsibilities he could not simply abandon. But he looked at his wife's face, saw the hope and the invitation there, and made a decision. "Yes," he said, "I will come with you. Peter can handle the ranch. This is too important. You are too important." They left in October, taking the train east, watching the landscape change from desert to prairie to farmland to cities. Eleanor had never been back east since leaving, and Duncan had never been at all. They pressed against the train window like children, marveling at the size of Chicago, the bustle of St. Louis, the green hills of Virginia. Washington, D.C. was unlike anything Duncan had imagined, with its grand buildings and wide streets, its monuments to democracy that felt ironic given the exclusion of half the population. The conference was held in a hotel ballroom, with women from every state and territory gathered to strategize about suffrage. Eleanor was the only participant who could not speak, but her reputation preceded her. Women approached her with reverence, asking her to write her thoughts, treating her slate like holy writ. Duncan found himself in the odd position of being his wife's literal voice, reading her written words to crowds, watching them nod and applaud. She gave what amounted to a speech to the full conference, with Duncan reading while she stood beside him. She wrote about the West, about how frontier life broke down some gender barriers by necessity, about how women there ran businesses and ranches and towns. She wrote about the debate in Coolidge, about the power of simple truth to change minds. She wrote about the evening classes, about women reclaiming their own potential. "We are told we are too delicate for politics," Duncan read from her slate. "But we are strong enough to birth nations, to endure hardship, to build civilization from raw land. We are told we are too emotional for reason, but we are clear-eyed enough to see injustice and brave enough to name it. We are told we are too important as mothers to be bothered with citizenship, but what kind of mothers can we be if we cannot protect our children with the law? The time for exclusion is over. The time for excuses is over. The time for equality is now." The ballroom erupted in standing ovation. Eleanor reached for Duncan's hand, squeezing tight, and he saw tears on her cheeks. This was her moment, the culmination of months of work, and he was honored to be part of it. They spent 2 weeks in Washington, attending sessions, making connections, learning strategy. Eleanor met Susan B. Anthony, who at 70 years old was still fighting, still believing. The two women communicated through Eleanor's slate and Anthony's patient reading, forging a friendship based on shared purpose. "You are doing crucial work in the territories," Anthony told them over tea in her hotel room. "The West is our best hope for suffrage. Wyoming already gave women the vote. Colorado, Utah, Idaho might follow. If enough territories and states grant suffrage, the federal government will have to acknowledge it." "What can we do to help?" Duncan asked, because Eleanor's hands were occupied with her teacup. Anthony looked at him with approval. "Keep doing what you are doing. Keep writing, keep organizing, keep pushing. Change does not come from the top down. It comes from the bottom up, from people like you two refusing to accept injustice." They returned to Arizona in late November, arriving home just before Thanksgiving. The ranch looked beautiful, with Peter having maintained it well, and Duncan felt a rush of relief at being back in familiar territory. But something had changed in them both. They had seen the wider world, understood their place in a larger movement, and it gave their work new urgency. Eleanor threw herself back into teaching and her evening classes with renewed energy. She wrote her columns with sharper focus, connecting territorial issues to national ones. She started corresponding with suffragists across the country, her slates filling with thoughts that would be transcribed and mailed to women from New York to California. Christmas of 1886 brought another gift. Eleanor was pregnant. She discovered it in late December and told Duncan on Christmas Eve, handing him a slate that simply read, "We are going to have a baby." Duncan stared at the words, then at his wife, then back at the words. Joy exploded in his chest, so intense it almost hurt. He picked Eleanor up and spun her around, laughing, and she laughed too, her silent laughter a shaking of shoulders and a brightness in her eyes that outshone any sound. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are having a baby." She nodded, smiling, glowing with happiness and health and the future made real. The pregnancy was not easy. Eleanor suffered from sickness in the early months, struggling to keep food down, exhausted in a way that worried Duncan. He insisted she stop riding to town, so she taught from home for a while, with students coming to the ranch for lessons. The evening classes were suspended, with Martha and Clara taking over temporarily using Eleanor's lesson plans. As her belly grew, Eleanor had to adjust everything. She could not bend over her slate as easily, so she started using large sheets of paper propped on an easel. She tired more quickly, but refused to stop working entirely. Her columns continued, now including thoughts on motherhood, on raising children to value equality, on the absurdity of denying women political rights while expecting them to raise the next generation of citizens. Duncan hovered like an anxious hawk, driving Eleanor to distraction. She finally wrote, "I am pregnant, not dying. Please stop treating me like glass." "I just want you safe," he protested. "You and the baby." "We are safe," she wrote, "but I need to be useful. I need purpose beyond growing this child. Please understand that." He did, though it was hard. He had never been so afraid in his life, terrified of losing her in childbirth, terrified of all the things that could go wrong. But he also respected her too much to cage her, so he found the balance between protection and freedom. The baby came in August 1887, during a monsoon storm that turned the desert into a temporary sea. Dr. Harrison from Coolidge arrived just in time, with Sarah Mitchell as midwife. Duncan paced outside the bedroom, listening to the storm and the sounds of labor, praying to every god he could name. When the baby's cry finally cut through the rain, Duncan burst into the room. Eleanor lay exhausted against the pillows, sweat-soaked and pale but smiling. Sarah was wrapping a squirming bundle in a blanket. "You have a son," the doctor said, grinning. "A healthy boy with a good set of lungs on him." Duncan moved to the bed in a daze, looking down at his son, at this tiny person who had not existed before today. The baby had dark hair like Duncan's, but Eleanor's delicate features. He was perfect. Eleanor reached out and Sarah placed the baby in her arms. She looked down at him with such love that Duncan had to wipe tears from his own eyes. She looked up at Duncan and mouthed, "Our son." "Our son," Duncan repeated, voice breaking. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, his arm around Eleanor, his other hand touching the baby's impossibly small fingers. "What should we name him?" Eleanor had to hand the baby to Duncan to write, but she had clearly been thinking about this. "James, after your father, Samuel, after mine." "James Samuel Xavier," Duncan said, testing it out. "It is perfect." The baby fussed, and Eleanor took him back, instinctively bringing him to her breast. Duncan watched his wife nurse their son, overwhelmed by the domesticity of it, by the realness of this family they had created. Motherhood changed Eleanor, but not in the ways Duncan had expected. She was softer in some ways, more patient, quicker to smile. But she was also fiercer, more determined that the world her son inherited be better than the one she had known. She went back to her columns 6 weeks after James was born, now writing about education reform, about childcare, about the need for women's voices in shaping policy that affected children. James was 6 months old when Eleanor received an invitation that would change everything again. The territorial governor, responding to pressure from suffragists nationwide, had agreed to hold a hearing on women's suffrage. He wanted Eleanor to testify. "This is it," Duncan said, reading the letter over Eleanor's shoulder while she nursed James. "This is a real chance at change." Eleanor's face was thoughtful. She could not write while nursing, so she waited until James fell asleep, then put him in his cradle before picking up her slate. "I want to testify, but I am afraid." "Of what?" "Of failing. Of not being persuasive enough. Of letting down every woman who has been counting on me." Duncan knelt beside her chair, taking her free hand. "Eleanor, you want to debate against Mayor Webb in front of a hostile crowd. You have changed this entire territory with nothing but chalk and truth. You will not fail. Come with me." She wrote. "Always," he promised. They traveled to Phoenix in March 1888, bringing James with them because Eleanor was still nursing. The territorial capital was a growing city, with the governor's palace, an imposing adobe structure that spoke of American ambition overlaid on Mexican and Spanish history. The hearing room was packed with spectators, reporters, and legislators. Eleanor wore her best dress, a green one that matched her eyes, with her hair pinned up and James in her arms. Duncan stood beside her, holding her slate board and chalk, ready to be her voice. Governor Mayer called the hearing to order, then invited Eleanor to present her testimony. She handed James to Duncan, who awkwardly juggled baby and slate while Eleanor wrote. Her testimony was methodical, building point by point. She wrote about the history of suffrage movements, about territories and states that had already granted women the vote without descending into chaos. She wrote about the specific needs of the Arizona Territory, where women owned property, ran businesses, and contributed equally to building civilization. She wrote about justice, about the fundamental principle that government derived its power from the consent of the governed, and that consent required participation. Duncan read her words, trying to put the passion he knew she felt into his voice. James cooed and babbled occasionally, as if adding his own commentary, which made the audience chuckle and soften the mood. When Eleanor finished her prepared testimony, legislators were invited to ask questions. A young representative from Tucson stood first. "Mrs. Xavier, I understand your arguments and I even agree with many of them, but I have a practical concern. Women have so many responsibilities already with home and children. Is it fair to add the burden of civic participation to their load?" Eleanor wrote quickly. "Men have responsibilities too. Jobs, farms, families. Yet we do not say they are too burdened to vote. Why do we assume women are less capable of managing multiple responsibilities? Also, many of the issues government decides affect home and family directly. Who better to weigh in on those issues than the women living them?" Duncan rayed and several people nodded. An older legislator clearly opposed to suffrage stood next. "But Mrs. Xavier, surely you must acknowledge that men and women are different. We are stronger, more suited to the rough world of politics. Women are gentler, meant for domestic life." "It is not prejudice but nature." Eleanor's chalk moved with controlled fury. "I crossed a continent to build a new life. I teach children whom others called unteachable. I survived losing my voice and my mother. I have birthed a child and continued working. Tell me again how delicate I am. Tell me again how I am not strong enough for the rough world of politics, while I live in a rough world every single day." The room erupted in applause and some boos. Duncan read her words with steel in his voice, and the opposing legislator sat down, red-faced. Question after question came, and Eleanor answered each one with clarity and precision. She never lost her temper, never resorted to emotion when logic would serve, but never hid her passion either. Duncan watched the legislators watching her, saw some minds changing, saw others hardening in opposition. Finally, Governor Mayer held up his hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Xavier, for your testimony. The committee will deliberate and make a recommendation to the full legislature." Eleanor nodded, took James back from Duncan, and walked out with her head high. They stayed in Phoenix for 3 days, waiting for the committee's decision. Eleanor was too nervous to eat much, spending her time nursing James and writing in her journal, processing her thoughts and fears. On the 3rd day, a messenger arrived at their hotel with a letter from the governor. Eleanor's hands shook as she opened it, read it, then passed it to Duncan. The committee had voted to recommend that the territorial legislature put women's suffrage to a referendum in the next general election. It was not an immediate victory, but it was progress, real progress. Eleanor buried her face in Duncan's shoulder and cried silent tears of relief and hope. He held her and their son, feeling the weight of history shifting around them. The referendum campaign consumed the next year. Eleanor wrote constantly, not just her regular columns but pamphlets, flyers, open letters to legislators. She organized women across the territory, creating networks of suffragists who would canvass, distribute literature, and convince their husbands and fathers and brothers to vote yes. Duncan became her campaign manager, organizing rallies, arranging speaking engagements, managing logistics. James came with them everywhere, passed between supporters, growing up amid the chaos of political change. They traveled to mining camps and ranches, to military forts and railroad towns. Everywhere they went, Eleanor's story resonated. A woman who had lost her voice but found a way to speak anyway, who had overcome obstacles that would have crushed someone with less determination. She became a symbol not just of suffrage but of possibility itself. Not everyone was convinced, of course. They faced hecklers and threats, towns where they were run out by angry mobs of men who saw suffrage as the end of civilization. Duncan kept Eleanor and James safe, his hand never far from the pistol he now carried, though he never had to draw it. Mayor Webb, predictably, led the opposition campaign in Coolidge. He gave speeches about the sanctity of traditional gender roles, about the chaos that would result from women voting. But his credibility had been damaged by his multiple defeats at Eleanor's hands, and most people in Coolidge ignored him. The referendum was held in November 1889. Eleanor and Duncan voted together, or rather Duncan voted yes on the referendum and Eleanor watched, holding James, knowing that if it passed, the next election would be different. The waiting was agony. Results had to be collected from across the vast territory, carried by telegraph and rider. It took 3 days to get a final count. The referendum failed, 53 to 47%. Eleanor took the news like a physical blow. She retreated to their bedroom in the Coolidge house they now kept for weekdays, holding James, staring at the wall. Duncan sat beside her, his own heart broken, not knowing what to say. Finally, she reached for her slate. "We lost." "We got 47%, Duncan said quietly. 4 years ago, we would have gotten maybe 20%. We changed minds, Eleanor. We moved the needle. That matters." "But we still lost," she wrote, and her tears fell on the slate, smudging the chalk. Duncan pulled her close, letting her grieve, letting her feel the disappointment and frustration. James squirmed between them, too young to understand but sensing his mother's distress, whimpering softly. For a week, Eleanor barely wrote. She taught her classes mechanically, took care of James, moved through life like a ghost. Duncan worried but gave her space, knowing she needed to process this in her own way. Then one morning he woke to find her side of the bed empty. He checked James' cradle, found it empty too, and panic seized him. He rushed through the house and found Eleanor on the back porch in the pre-dawn darkness, James sleeping in her arms, her slate balanced on her knees. She had written, "We start again. We build on what we learned. We find the voters we missed. We change more minds. We do not stop until we win." Duncan's heart swelled with love and admiration. "You are sure?" She looked up at him, and even in the dim light he could see the determination in her eyes. She nodded. "Then we start again," he agreed. And they did. Over the next 2 years, Eleanor refined her approach. She focused more on practical arguments than abstract justice, talking about how women's votes could clean up corrupt politics, improve schools, address public health issues. She built coalitions with labor unions, with religious groups, with farmers' organizations. She made suffrage about community improvement rather than just women's rights. She also stepped back from being the face of the movement, recognizing that some men would never listen to a woman, no matter how compelling her arguments. She trained other women to speak, to organize, to lead. She built a movement bigger than herself. James grew from baby to toddler, learning to walk and talk amid campaign meetings and organizing sessions. His first word was "Mama," signed in the hand alphabet Eleanor was teaching him. His second was "Vote," clear as a bell, making everyone in the room laugh. In 1891, the territorial legislature, now with several pro-suffrage members elected with Eleanor's help, voted to put suffrage on the ballot again. This time, they had a better campaign, better organization, better messaging. This time, in November 1891, the referendum passed, 56 to 44%. When the news came, Eleanor was teaching her evening class. Duncan burst into the schoolhouse, picked her up, and spun her around while the women cheered and cried and hugged each other. "You did it," Duncan said, setting her down, his own eyes wet. "Eleanor, you did it." She pulled out her slate with shaking hands. "We did it. All of us." The women celebrated late into the night, laughing and planning, talking about the next election when they would finally be able to vote. Eleanor's face glowed with joy, and Duncan thought he had never seen her more beautiful. The first election where Arizona Territory women could vote was in 1892. Eleanor was 29 years old, had been married for 7 years, and had spent most of that time fighting for this moment. She stood in line at the polling place in Coolidge, holding James' hand with Duncan beside her. When it was her turn, she stepped up to the registrar, the same man who had accepted her registration for teaching years ago. "Name?" he asked, though he knew perfectly well who she was. Eleanor wrote on her slate, "Eleanor Drake Xavier." "And you are here to vote," she nodded, her chin high, her eyes bright. The registrar smiled, a genuine expression. "It is my honor to give you a ballot, Mrs. Xavier." She took the paper with reverent care, moved to the booth, and marked her choices with deliberate precision. She voted for school funding, for clean water initiatives, for candidates who supported workers' rights and public education. She voted for the world she wanted James to grow up in. When she submitted her ballot, dropping it into the box, Duncan saw her close her eyes for just a moment, savoring it. Then she picked up James, took Duncan's hand, and walked out into the Arizona sunshine. Over the next years, life settled into a new rhythm. Eleanor continued teaching, but the pressure of activism eased slightly now that the immediate goal was achieved. She still wrote her columns, still organized women, but she also allowed herself to simply be a wife and mother. James was joined by a daughter, Ruth, in 1893, named for the woman from Eleanor's evening class who had learned to read the Bible. Ruth was quieter than James but equally curious, following her mother around, watching her write, learning letters before she could fully talk. In 1895, a son named Thomas arrived, loud and active from birth, keeping Eleanor and Duncan constantly busy. Their house was filled with noise and chaos and love, with children's laughter and the scratch of chalk, with Duncan's deep voice and Eleanor's silent presence that somehow anchored everything. Duncan expanded the ranch, buying adjoining property, building it into one of the most successful operations in the territory. He hired more hands, including several women who wanted ranch work and found him willing to judge them on skill rather than gender. Eleanor's influence had changed him, changed how he saw the world, and he liked the man he had become. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1896, Duncan took Eleanor back to the Silver Dollar Saloon, the site of her debate victory. Pete, the owner, had kept her slate board from that night, mounted on the wall like a trophy. The final line she had written was still visible. Wisdom is not in blindly following the past, but in having the courage to correct its mistakes. "You changed this whole territory," Duncan said, his arm around Eleanor's waist as they looked at the board. "You changed me. You changed our children's future. How does that feel?" Eleanor pulled out her ever-present slate. "Like the beginning, not the end. There is still so much to do." "But tonight," Duncan said, turning her to face him, "tonight we celebrate what has been done." They danced, as they had at their wedding, moving together with the ease of long practice. Other couples joined them, and the saloon filled with music and laughter. Sarah Mitchell was there with her new husband. Martha had become a published poet. Clara ran the general store now, having saved enough to buy it from Sarah. Ruth, the older woman from the evening class, had taught her own daughters to read. The women Eleanor had helped had gone on to help others. Ripples spreading out from that first debate, from those first evening classes, from one woman's refusal to accept silence. James, Ruth, and Thomas grew up in a world their mother had fought to create. James attended university in California, studying law, determined to fight for justice as his mother had. Ruth became a teacher like Eleanor, carrying on the legacy. Thomas took over the ranch, partnering with Duncan to build something that would last generations. Eleanor kept writing her columns until 1910, when arthritis made it too painful to hold chalk. By then, she had written over 1,000 pieces, each one a small push toward equality, toward justice, toward a better world. Her columns were collected into books, distributed across the country, used as teaching tools in schools and suffrage organizations. In 1912, when Arizona became a state, its constitution included women's suffrage, one of the first state constitutions to do so. Eleanor and Duncan attended the ceremony in Phoenix, now in their early 50s, their children grown, grandchildren starting to arrive. Governor Hunt, who had read Eleanor's columns for years, sought her out after the ceremony. "Mrs. Xavier, you should know that your work was directly cited in the debates about our Constitution. You helped make Arizona a place of equality. The state owes you a debt." Eleanor wrote on the slate she still carried everywhere. "The state owes its women the respect of listening to them." "That is all I ever asked." Duncan stood beside her, his hair graying now but his love as strong as ever. They had built a life together, a family, a legacy that would outlast them both. The ranch prospered, their children thrived, and the territory they had helped shape became a state that valued all its citizens. In 1920, when the 19th Amendment passed, granting all American women the right to vote, Eleanor was 59 years old. She and Duncan sat on their porch, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and toasted the victory with elderflower wine from their own vines. "We did it," Duncan said, clinking his glass against hers. "All the way. Full suffrage nationwide." Eleanor pulled out her slate, her handwriting shakier now but still legible. "It took too long, but it happened. That is what matters." "You made it happen," James said from where he sat with his own children. "You and the other suffragists, you never gave up." Eleanor shook her head and wrote, "I gave up many times, but I always started again. That is the secret, not perfection, persistence." The family gathered around, multiple generations, and Duncan looked at his wife, at the woman who had walked into his life during a debate in a saloon and changed everything. She caught his eye and smiled, that same smile that had captured him 35 years ago. That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Duncan and Eleanor sat alone on the porch as they had so many nights before. The desert stretched out around them, vast and beautiful, a land they had helped shape, had raised children in, had made their own. "You have any regrets?" Duncan asked, taking her hand. Eleanor considered, then wrote, "I regret the time it took. I regret the women who died before seeing equality. I regret that I could not do more faster. But I do not regret the fight itself. And I do not regret you. You were the best choice I ever made." "Second best," Duncan corrected gently. "The first was refusing to be silenced. I was just lucky enough to witness it." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged, one by one, turning the sky into a map of possibility. Eleanor lived to be 83 years old, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1944, with Duncan holding her hand and their children surrounding the bed. She had outlived the debate by nearly 60 years, had seen women vote in multiple elections, had watched her own granddaughters grow up in a world where their voices mattered. Duncan followed her 6 months later, his heart simply giving out one morning as he sat on their porch, holding the last slate she had written on. It read, "Thank you for giving me a voice when the world tried to take it away. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for loving me. I will love you forever." Their children buried them together on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a single headstone that listed their names, dates, and a quote from Eleanor's first column. "Truth needs no sound to be heard. It only needs courage to be spoken." The Xavier Ranch continued for generations, passed down through family, a testament to what two people could build together. Eleanor's columns were preserved in university archives, studied by historians and activists. The schoolhouse in Coolidge was converted into a museum, with her original slate board from the debate displayed prominently. But their real legacy was simpler and more profound. Children who grew up believing in equality, grandchildren who never questioned whether women belonged in public life, great-grandchildren who lived in a world Eleanor and Duncan had fought to create. The story of the woman who could not speak but won a debate, and the cowboy who watched her write truth that changed everything, became a legend in Arizona. People told it to their children, a reminder that change was possible, that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences, that love and determination could overcome any obstacle. And on quiet desert nights, when the wind moved through the scrub brush and the stars blazed overhead, old-timers swore they could still see two figures on the hill where Eleanor and Duncan were buried, sitting side by side, her hand moving across an invisible slate, his voice carrying her words into the eternal sky, their love transcending even death, their partnership continuing in whatever lay beyond. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and changed their corner of the world. In the end, what more could anyone ask for?